So everybody, welcome for this breakout session. I have a couple of things I want to highlight first. First, let me introduce myself, and then I'll introduce the panel. My name is Bob Ashley, retired from the Army in November of 2020, and I still have 45 days left of my cooling off period, so be careful as you approach me. A couple of things I want to highlight. First, let me say thanks to our sponsor, Palo Alto, for sponsoring this session. This is something that is absolutely critical to what we do in the intelligence community, and we're very fortunate to have the panel up here today to talk about this. If you have questions on this topic, Ray Cross and the team will be taking your questions on cards. Start writing those out now, or as you hear issues as we go through the discussion. We're going to go for about 40 minutes, and then we'll transition to questions so we can get some feedback from the room as well. If you're looking for continuing education credit, I'm told that you get no continuing education credit for this. My apologies in advance. Media may be present during the breakout session, I'm told, so I will not ask you to raise your hands. But just for Greg's, you're on the record, man, as we move ahead. So our topic: public data and intelligence community analysis, improving integration and public-private capabilities, and understand the impact on national security and decision-making. This is one of the things that we have. It's been prolific how much discussion has been ongoing about how we're leveraging data, open information, public available information, commercial, and the role of open source in production. So this is a very meaty topic and something that we've been talking about a lot in the IC and clearly in the community. But let me introduce the panel members for you, and I'm going to jump past Greg since Fred is the first one on my piece of paper here. And thank you all for being here today. I appreciate this greatly, being part of this. So Dr. Fred Kagan is the Director of Critical Threats Project at the American Enterprise Institute. Previously served in Kabul, Afghanistan as part of General McChrystal's strategic assessment team. He also did research in Afghanistan for General Petraeus, General John Allen. Came over to see me when I was the ICFJ2, gave me some counsel. I told Fred I was not going to bring up our discussions that the Haqqani network was tantamount to the Corleone family in my analysis. But it was a good chat when Fred and Kim came to see us. His most recent book is Lessons for the Long War: How America Can Win on New Battlefields. Previously, he was an associate professor at West Point. He's a contributing editor at the Weekly Standard. He's written in Foreign Affairs, Wall Street Journal, The Post, Times, and chances are you guys see his work every day in the Institute for the Study of War on the work that they do on Ukraine. To my right, Greg Reichmann was appointed the Deputy Director for Global Integration, the DDGI at DIA, in April of 2021. In this role, he is responsible for prioritizing the agency's mission to include analysis, collection, operations, partner integration in support of global strategic competition. He directly leads all the integrated intel centers, so all the analysts work for Greg, provides mission oversight for both analysis, operations, and the Science and Technology Directorate. And before going into the DDGI, Greg was the Director of Analysis, and before that he was the Deputy J2 at Central Command, a former Army FAO officer and a graduate of the Pakistan Army Command and Staff College. And on my far right, Kristen Wood is the CEO and president of the Gristmill Exchange. She's a former senior executive at CIA with a 20-year career where she served in 3 directorates of analysis, operation, and digital innovation, specializing in transforming existing programs and building new capabilities. Kristen was the PDB, Presidential Daily Briefer, for Vice President Cheney and led the Director's Analytics Support Team and built and led the agency's Advanced Analysis Program and served as the Deputy Chief for Middle East-Focused Operations Division. And in her final role in government, she served as the Deputy Director for Innovation in the Technology Group of the Open Source Center. So you can see the credentials that we have are pretty deep, and the good thing is we cover a couple of the major agencies. We cover the IC, and we have folks that with their feet both in and outside of government in terms of their perspectives. So the criticism on public available information commercial is that we're not doing enough. And if you're watching what's been written, it covers the gamut, all the way from should we build just a career field, do we need to build an agency? And there's a lot happening in the IC. And personally, having seen that from my time at Fort Huachuca back in 2013, if you ever read an article that says, the IC still looks at this as reading the newspaper, that is woefully off the mark. Because there's a lot of work that's been done across the IC within the services to build this out. But at the same time, a year ago, myself and a former acting deputy director of national intelligence wrote an article that we're not scaling this and we're not funding it appropriately, which I think is still a valid criticism. The complexity when we talk about this in terms of analysis, and I'll use geospatial for an example before we go to questions, is probably when you think about open or public available information, geospatial was the first one that we really got our arms around, but it was a single discipline. And for all the geospatial folks, not that there isn't complexity, there is, but when you go from geospatial to all source analysis and how you put that together and how you account for tradecraft and other aspects of that, that's a level of complexity that we want to talk about today, because it is far more intricate and detailed in terms of how we sort that out and we move ahead. So how do we integrate? There's been lots of studies on open source. Matter of fact, it's been prolific. One of the first ones that I read after getting out of off of active duty was the one that the think tank CSIS wrote. And although it wasn't solely on open source, it was on maintaining the intelligence edge from January 21, it came out with 103 different recommendations. On that panel that went through that study was the current DNI, a former USDI, a former principal deputy of the USDI, a former acting CI director, and the former CENTCOM commander. So you had a lot of people looking at that. Like I said, there was 103 recommendations, and one of the principal ones was we need to raise this to a core int. We need to integrate Osin into collection strategies, analytic tradecraft, and examining, partnering with industry, and consider, and we'll come to this as one of our last questions, creating an Osin agency. So like I said, we'll spend about 40 minutes on questions up here, and then we'll go to the audience. So let me start with Greg, because I think one part of this I want to do is get kind of a baseline for everybody. When we talk about analytic tradecraft, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to the IC? Because there's a piece of this and how this works in the private sector as well. So if you can just take a minute and kind of talk about the attributes of analytic tradecraft, and then how is DIA currently leveraging public available, commercial available data, and a little bit about what your open source center is doing. And I asked Greg to also comment on one, because probably a lot of you read somewhere in some report where it said, actually 80% of what's been published is coming from open source anyway. And I think Greg and I both, in his current role and my previous job as a DI director, probably said that, and we didn't source it very well in the process. So, but I'll ask Greg to kind of kick us off on those questions.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And thanks for being able to be part of the panel. I would also say thank you for pointing out my poor tradecraft on saying 80%. But what I will say is I do believe it's true. And can I put a number on that? Probably not. But the point is, when you think about big data and the amount of information that's out there and our increasing ability to figure out how to take big data and translate that into intelligence, that number does get a lot higher. Is it 80%? I don't know. It could be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. But it's instructive to understand if 80% of our information that we're using is open source information, we have to change how we do business, right? Because a lot of our models are based off of a system where that number is reversed, right? So it's a good number to think about as we try to struggle with how we get after this challenge. Starting off with tradecraft, I would say, at DIA we break this into kind of two parts of a question. So when we think open source intelligence tradecraft, for us that's a collection discipline. And we have very purposely tried to get to where open source intelligence is a collection discipline, but we do all source analysis. And so I'll break that out a little bit. But for years what we had was analysts trying to sort through volumes of open source information at the same time that they're trying to deal with the classified information that they have to pull in. And so what we've done at DIA is stood up an open source intelligence center, which is there to purposely create a collection discipline to be able to get after open source intelligence in a way, not exactly like we would do for other ints, because open source is different, but to be able to look at trying to ensure we find the right kind of sources, understand where those sources come from, et cetera, right? Get rid of duplicative buying of data, et cetera. So I won't spend a lot of time on that, but we'll probably touch on this a couple times as we go through. that open source intelligence tradecraft for us is really on the collection side, and that's starting to pay dividends. Analytically, we're an all-source intelligence agency. And what that means is we try really hard at least to not write single source assessments. And what's interesting, go back to the 80% again, if you're an all-source analyst and you're not fully optimizing open source intelligence, you're actually probably a some source analyst, right? Because there's a lot of open source information you're probably not getting to. So how do we make sure that all that open source information is available to that all-source analyst so they can actually be an all-source analyst? The flip side of that is if you're predominantly or only using open source information, you're probably a single source analyst, which is also not what we're looking for. So the challenge is, as an all-source analyst, our tradecraft requires a few things. One of them is it requires us to convey likelihood and confidence. It's both parts, right? We have to be able to say, here's the likelihood a thing is going to happen. So you'll see in an assessment, people get frustrated sometimes when we say, most likely, probably, highly likely. And an intelligence assessment doesn't deal in certainty, it deals in probability. So that's an important component of it. And when I see analysts or I see products in the Intel community that say something is a fact, I get a little nervous because we deal in probabilities. The second part is confidence level. That confidence level comes out of the quality of your sourcing, right? So if you have a single source report, you can produce that, but you're going to have a very low confidence level because you don't have other sourcing to be able to compare that against. So that's part of our tradecraft that we go through. So we can say to somebody, this is most likely going to happen, and I have high, moderate, or low confidence in my assessment that it's going to happen, which allows the customer to be able to make a judgment off of that and say, okay, I'm pretty comfortable with that, or let me look at some other things and to balance it as they make their decision. The second thing is we work very hard to root bias out of our analysis, right? So there's peer review, there's multiple layers of review, and source checking, and to make sure that as best you can, and you never really get rid of bias completely, but you can mitigate it as much as possible. And then the last part, I think, would be transparency, so that you can deconstruct your argument for the customer. If the customer wants to say, what assumptions did you use, et cetera, you can go back and say, this is the assumption that I used, or multiple of them. And so that's really kind of where our tradecraft gets to, and it's all about trying to make sure that we're including, because the ICD requires us to consider all available information when we make an assessment. That's just the requirement. Now, you can find a declassified or degraded level, not degraded, but a releasable level for that product, but it has to have considered all information you had available, which is a bar that our analysts have to meet when they do an assessment. I think, sir, in terms of PAI, CAI, and open source, most of that 80% is in that PAI, CAI space, right? It's in that big data space. And so we're doing a lot of work to create data literate analysts. You don't have to be a data scientist. You have to be able to understand how data works. You have to be able to understand how data can work for you, how data might be confusing and actually cause you more problems. But data literacy, and then we have to have the tools that we can actually get through that big data and translate that into intelligence and be able to make assessments with it. On the open source center side, the big thing we're trying to do is establish standards across the defense intelligence enterprise. So we have common standards that we're doing as we do open source collection, and looking for tools. We have, it's having 10 different tools that don't interact with each other is not helpful. So how do we come with some common standards on tools, on tradecraft, and then try not to all buy the same data and then have to be purchasing the same data multiple times. So that's a lot of what we're trying to do. And then with that, put that open source information in the hands of the analysts so they can incorporate it into their all source assessments. And I think I'll stop there, sir, on that.
Yeah, so I got kind of a follow-up for Greg on that one. When you look at the tradecraft and when you look at everything that's coming in and that volume of information and the speed in which you need to get information out, do you see this changing tradecraft at all? Or are you confident that you kind of continue with what you have?
So I think this is always interesting, right? Because the tradecraft itself is, that you can say probability and confidence level, that you can make sure you mitigate bias, but the methodologies that we use are different, right? So how we apply our analytic methodologies, I think, definitely has to change. How do you get it to where machines and analysts can work on an analytic product at the same time? How do you get to where you get confidence that a machine can reach a confidence level looking at data that you can move forward with something or leverage that to be able to make another judgment? So I think there's some methodologies we have to change and understand. We have to create a data literate workforce that can work in that space. But the principles of tradecraft don't change. If we have a machine working for us analytically, it also has to be able to do probability and confidence levels. And we have to be able to deconstruct where it got the information from. We have to be able to understand from a data source, if we're talking about PI and CI, where did that come from and how do we articulate it? So the principles stay the same, but I think our methodologies have to change so that we can incorporate it into our products.
So one last point for Greg before I go to Fred, because this kind of sets up a little bit of the context. So more and more companies now are actually moving beyond providing just data, they're getting analysis with this information that they're pulling together and aggregating. And you see that, and we'll come back to like Bell and Cat and others that do investigations. But before I go to Fred, just the last thing I ask you to comment, because the work that Fred's folks do on the Institute for the Study of War in Ukraine is something that is falling on senior leaders' desks every single day, and it's one of their must-reads. And I've got a lot of seniors that come back and said, yeah, I look at this every single day. So for Greg, talk a little bit about the context of, when you're an analyst who's the PDB briefer or somebody goes into a DASD or somebody inside, the Pentagon, and your senior's holding up, we'll use the ISW for an example there for Fred because it's a great product. And then the stuff that you guys are producing, how do you coach them to kind of reconcile those? Because you always get the discussions of, well, is this a challenge? Does it challenge our relevance? Things like that.
First I would say that darn Fred Kagan did it to me again, but no. So I think the first thing to think about is there's plenty of knowledge gaps out there that we need all the capability we can have to fill those knowledge gaps. So when I'm coaching analysts or talking to folks is, don't ever get upset that someone else is contributing to solving a problem, because that's part of the solution, right? And one thing that Intel analysts, as I talked about, we deal in probability and confidence levels. What we don't deal in is facts, right? We don't do that. That's history. That's looking backwards. We also don't have a monopoly on right. Whenever analysts come in and say, but I was right, well, okay, so your assessment of probability and confidence might have been right. But if you're striving for right, you're missing the point, because what you're supposed to do is say, this is a likelihood and this is our confidence level. So one is we got to be careful that we don't somehow think that that we're better or something else. Embrace the fact that there's other folks out there contributing to the answer to the problem. That's the first piece. The second part is that we do different things, right? So what are value propositions, right? So the DIA, or the intelligence community's value proposition is that when it does enter that conversation with that senior leader can say it's an all-source assessment, at least if it's coming from DIA, it's Tradecraft compliant, it's all the things that we do, and they can be confident that's what it is. And that's our value proposition. That's what makes us distinct and different as we go through that process, and we incorporate all those sources into it. That doesn't make anybody better or worse. That's just our value proposition. And it's okay for us to be different in terms of how we do that than what the private sector does. Because many times the private sector will be in the room first, right? There might be that article that comes out before we get in with an assessment. That's okay. We're not in a race to get in the room. CNN's going to beat all of us probably, right? So it's about informing that senior leader on their decision as they're making their decision. And what we need to be confident of on our end is our value proposition is when we come in, they know that we've delivered that assessment that's gone through our process and provides them that information. And as long as we continue to do that, then we'll have the ear of that senior customer when they get to our product. And then they've got whatever might have come in from some other source of information that they can look at and compare to ours and make their own decision.
Yeah. So thanks. So Fred, talk a little bit about your process, a little bit of the Tradecraft, how you work assessments, and kind of using the ISW for kind of your flagship product and how that works.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you so much for having me on the panel. It's a real honor. I want to actually just start by addressing Greg's last comment and say, I don't know about other people in this space. The IC is not our competition. ISW and the Critical Threats Project, where I work at AEI, we are nonprofits, and by policy we take no money from the government, any government. So we are not in competition with the IC. Our mandate and our purpose is to help the IC do its job. We regard the IC as a customer that we never charge. And so it's we have no delusions that we are going to replace the IC, and because I think the opportunity I've had to sit with Bob and General Fogarty and other fantastic people in Afghanistan is, I think I've got a pretty good sharp understanding of what the limits of Osin, if you will, are, and what we're never going to be able to do with Osin, and what we shouldn't do. and what only the IC can do. And I internalize that, I have that. So there's no issue from our perspective, from my perspective anyway, of competition here. The point is to help the IC serve the nation. That's what we're engaged in. All of the tradecraft that Greg described, we do. We teach our interns, we teach our analysts how to deal with source bias, how to understand sources. We have a peer review process before anything goes out. We have a source review process, and we're fully transparent. We show you all of our data. We show you all of our sources. We publish them with everything that we put out there. And one of the key elements of our tradecraft is we will never ask you to take our word for anything, which insulates us from a bunch of critiques about who's funding us or whose interests are we serving, and periodically people attack as everybody attacks. It's easier to do ad hominem attacks and wrestle with arguments a lot of the time. And my answer is always, who cares? Here's the document, here's the assessment, here's all the logic, and here's all the sources. Go look, okay? If you're too lazy to look, that's your problem. But you can make your own evaluation of our sources, and that's one of the reasons we do that is because we know that the IC can't take our word for it and shouldn't take our word for it. So we're never looking for any kind of stamp of approval from the IC that says, the ISW is good, therefore nobody needs to look at the source. No, evaluate everything we put out there. Our tradecraft, so, we were talking about this before. I do think, I will stand by a comment that I make periodically, that if you call it OSINT, you don't really understand what it is. Because OSINT isn't an int, from my perspective, in the way that imint is, or humint, or sigint. Obviously, there are technical requirements, and I think the challenge that the IC faces in terms of integrating OSINT is a big one. But we're not single source analysts. We're all source analysts. We're all source analysts of publicly available intelligence, publicly available information. So we have satellite imagery partners. There's limited kinds of SIGINT that we can do in various different ways. We choose as policy not to do HUMINT. Other open source organizations do use HUMINT. So all of those ints are out there in PAI. It's just that they behave differently and you integrate them differently. So we're all source in our own way. But of course we're not all source because we don't have access to the exquisite intelligence either. In terms of tradecraft, look, we live in a low to no trust environment. There are no objective sources in our world, and we don't look for objective sources. One of the first things you have to teach people who are operating in the PAI space is there's no such thing as an objective source. So how do you deal with source bias? Well, you have to have multiple sourcing. And you have to have protocols and this is something we've really necked down on this for the Ukraine war. We are mapping at the village level. And it amazes me how our young team has figured out how to do this. How do you map at the village level? Well, you get a lot of social media reporting. You get Ukrainian general staff, Ukrainian GUR reporting, you get Russian MOD reporting, you get Russian media reporting, Ukrainian media reporting, Western media reporting. You bring all of that together. There's a whole OSINT ecosystem out there of people who are geolocating events and looking at timestamps and all of that kind of stuff, showing their work, and we look at that. And we make our calls based on what we can corroborate from all of the different sources. And the more sources that we have of different types, the more confident we are in the assessment. If it's a single source, you will see in our updates that we publish all the time, we will say, so-and-so reported such and such, we have no ability to verify this at this time. And we'll just put that out there in all of our reports are very dull in that sense, because they also do include our statements of whether we have any basis actually to validate the information or whether it's a single source that we're putting out there and it's a single source, and we'll say that. We also reflect our confidence assessments, both graphically and in text. And in the maps that we publish, there are multiple layers. And we distinguish between the control zone, the controlled terrain that we assess the Russians actually control, and assessed Russian advances. And buried in there is a confidence assessment. Because in the zone that is assessed Russian advances, and we try to make this as clear as we can't tell you whether the Russians control that town or the Ukrainians control that town. We can tell you the Russians were there. But the Ukrainians have been fighting and we don't know. And so there are implicit visual assessments in there. And when we publish our product frequently, we will also offer the same kind of assessment observations as well. Now, one of the things about the world we live in is I don't think I've ever published a high confidence assessment at CTP or ISW, because my understanding of the source environment I'm operating in is there's virtually never an assessment where the sourcing is so good that I'm prepared to say that it's a high confidence assessment, so good about anything that's interesting to say. I mean, there are times when I give you a high confidence assessment, but it's like the sun is shining. But we do publish a lot more low confidence assessments than the intelligence community would ever be comfortable doing, and we're just explicit about that. So the Tradecraft is recognizing that there is no such thing as objective sources. We do source characterizations, and then we use that to have sources fight with each other and corroborate as best we can, and then we're as explicit as we can in presentation to the public about our confidence assessment, sources, reasoning, and all of that kind of stuff, and offer it up to people to say, here it is, this is it, use your judgment and ask us questions if you have them.
So I wanted to use that opportunity, and Fred, thanks for that, to kind of lay a foundation of the complexities of what it means to actually do all source analysis. And so what I'd ask Kristen to do, now you've heard Fred's comments, Greg as well, let's go back to the core question. The question really is, how do we integrate it, the public-private partnership, whether that's in a production, whether it's tasking or things like that. So having sat on both sides of this, and step back from a little bit, how would you counsel us for, where is the opportunity and then the risk in that integration or that, more greater teaming?
Well, so thank you very much for having me here, first of all, and to be with both of you to hear what you had to say, and to all of you today for being here. I think what was really interesting to me to hear from Greg and Fred, just to start, is what Greg is describing at DIA is definitely what we see in terms of the methodological approach that DIA and OSIC in particular are taking to looking at commercially available and publicly available information in a really systematic, rigorous way that looks at not only kind of metadata and data descriptions, things like that, but also data quality attributes. And so seeing that level of sophistication around how they make decisions to buy it or not buy it, or to characterize the data is really unusual a bit in terms of just the customers with whom we engage. And it is definitely what we're seeing in terms of the data literacy component that is being developed and expanded at DIA. One of the things you talked about is data literate analysts, and I think it's funny, and this is going to date me more than anything, but when I was an all-source analyst, I could get my queue read by, I don't know, 1 or 2, and so anything that I was going to need to read that day, I was done with, so then I could do the analytic work, and it's fantasy now. So thinking about the challenge here where you have billions of insights coming in on a daily basis, it's not the data scientists, although they're fantastic and they can do this hard work, but it's having the data literacy to know how to pull the data, how to use the tools in a way that produces insights that meet the Tradecraft standards that you describe. I think a little bit that speed to insight is the game we're in. And classically in the IC, that is something that we've excelled at in many, many wars. Speed to insight on the outside can be a lot faster, as you say. CNN is on the ground. But with this world of open source investigations, where you end up having this dispersed global community of people who are tracking down Russian atrocities in Ukraine, for example, or the Malaysian aircraft that was shot down, or going after the Skripal poisoners, they have this ability that is really both excellent from a tradecraft perspective and the breadth. They're not defined by a skiff, and I think incorporating that is how do we do that? And I guess that's the question you've asked me that I'm so far delaying on responding to. Changing the methodology is really important, and I think what Fred described too is tradecraft in institutions like major corporations that are using this information to make billions or trillions of dollars of decision making Am I pulling my folks out of country? Is this a place that I want to invest my folks as a private equity company? Am I willing to take a risk of buying a company in this country based on the rule of law? They have excellent tradecraft around that decision making. And I think one of the things that you said, Fred, I have been struggled to describe Osin because in my day it was kind of a bad word. I mean, like, okay, yeah, you get like Paris AFP reporting and it's not true, but then you're still stuck explaining it to a high-level policymaker. So this idea that it is all source, that it could be sensor-based from bridges where you're looking at either pollutants or some kind of weapons of mass destruction coming in. It could be text-based, it could be geosatellite, it could be RF, it could be telematics. Whatever it is, it's this breadth of sources that suddenly the OSINT person has to be able to understand and name and apply quality tradecraft to so that we can have confidence in it. I think that for me, the reason to partner and kind of shifting to that question is this is a must-win space from my perspective for the United States. I really feel if we do not capture this space at scale and at speed, we are going to lose our country. And I know that sounds dramatic, and it's a little painful to say, but I do believe this is where, because open systems grow so fast, and you've all seen data is growing by the zettabyte, and in open systems, they grow like that. Closed systems don't. And when there is already so much available, I think we're only at something like 5 zettabytes being produced annually. If we go to 37, as experts predict, 37 zettabytes, so one is 300 million times the holdings of a Library of Congress, just for perspective. We're talking about going to 37 zettabytes in 2025. What, 2.5 years from now? And so the idea of data lakes and data holdings and how we process data and what we do with it, what we choose to keep, there's a fundamental challenge here that I think that has to be a big area where the public and private sector partner. I feel like the tradecraft is exceptional, not only as you're describing in nonprofit organizations that do this so excellently, but in financial institutions. The media journalists that are doing this open source investigation, where there's Bellingcat, or I think the New York Times, the Washington Post, have these remarkable efforts that they've undertaken, but also academia. And some of them are starting to teach classes on open source. So for me, I think a little bit the paradigm has to be, we're used to being best in class in the IC, best in the world for tradecraft. I think this is a place to get really humble and say, there's also way outside our space people who are best in the world at their tradecraft, and we need to have access to their data and their tradecraft so that we can own the world's data, not just that is classified. I think some kind of a consortium model, and I don't feel like it's owning it that is the answer, but access to trusted tech companies, data companies, large companies that do this for a living. There's a chemical company that I work with, International Global, and they and their team predicted the exact day of the Russian invasion because of the tools and tradecraft they had available to them. They also successfully were able to get their people out of Houston when the floods hit because they took all the weather data and all the prior flooding data, and they were able to secure the means for departure ahead of all of their competitors and frankly much of the local government. So there's a lot to learn here in this space. It's a dynamic opportunity, and I'll close here just by saying I don't think anyone sees themselves in competition with the US government. We desperately need the US government to succeed, so it's how can we help in a way that's useful and valuable so that the insights that are being produced on the outside come to you via funnel that is usable, helpful, valuable, so that maybe there's some work that cleared analysts don't have to do, or they can just check the work and add the exquisite national technical means to it to create yet new insights. So I'll just go ahead and stop there.
Thanks, Christian. So I'm going to give Greg and Fred a chance to take a swing at that, a little more of a preamble going into it. So every year, you get the National Intelligence Priorities Framework, right? So that's what you're getting from a production standpoint. And then DIA is going to turn out a Defense Intel Analyst production schedule. So when you think about, because I'm going to come to Fred to ask him how can the, private sector be better utilized as well. But from your perspective, you have the NIPIF, you have the DIAP, you have global requirements. We've talked about speed and the importance of indications and warning. Where do you see that teaming and integration most optimized?
No, I think, and I agree with everything that you both said. I think the challenge, we can't compete, we can't afford to compete, we got too much to do. And so our challenge is how do we collaboratively work together? And I think that's the piece that becomes complicated but not impossible. So you talked about a consortium kind of thing. I think I got to think through that. It's probably a further conversation. General Ashley mentioned DIAP. For those who don't know what DIAP is, it's essentially a federation system that we use in the Defense Intelligence Enterprise to basically say, an organization's accountable to be the lead on a topic. It might be a regional topic or a functional topic, and then that federated enterprise can count on that entity kind of delivering that analysis or covering down on that topic. And so what's fascinating to me is how could we look at potentially something where the private sector or the academic community could have a piece of that, right? And so that's intriguing to me. Now, the challenge we have there, a couple of them. One of them is on the Tradecraft side, and I do agree, and Fred's comment about open source actually covers a lot more than one discipline, which is true. But getting to a point, because we would have to be able to vouch for that assessment through an ICD compliant lens. And I think we struggle with this piece of you have to consider all available information, but many times it's 95% open source and 5% in that classified world. That's reconcilable to do, right? So how could you close that gap? There's probably a way to do that. I think the hardest part I think that we would have to bridge is having been the director for analysis at DIA, in that federated system, if there's a thing that somebody in that federation is expected to do, I kind of have to know they're going to do it. Because, and the good news is their money comes largely through DIA and they're working under direct DOD priorities, et cetera. If there was a private entity or an academic institution who may have a change in priorities and they are like, well, you know what, we're not doing that now, that creates a big challenge for us because now I've got an entire enterprise that I got to shift around to cover down. So I think that part would be another piece that we would have to work through to make sure that we could all kind of be able to cover each other. But the idea of leveraging what's happening in the open source analysis side of the house, the private and the academic sector, I think we definitely have to figure out how we go down that pathway. I also don't know that we have to take it in and sprinkle Intel fairy dust on it. I think that analysis being part of the mosaic of information available to a decision maker as it stands is also valuable, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a burden sharing piece and then there's an additive knowledge piece that we should both look at embracing.
So Fred, from your lens, how can they better leverage you in the IC?
Well, I think Greg, I agree. Actually, let me approach this with a lot of humility because I know enough about the IC to be dangerous. I know enough to know how hard at this kind of integration of the Osin ecosystem would be for all the reasons that Greg gave and many others. At the end of the day, I don't think the IC has a choice because you can't afford to buy Osin. You can't afford it. Your budget is too small to begin with. I can say that comfortably because I'm not in the IC and I'm not getting any of your money. So I have no dog in this fight, except the interest of the United States of America, and the intelligence community budget in this country is too small. There are things that only the IC can do, by law and by function. I'm worried that OSINT is an elephant that can eat your whole budget, and you still would not be able to swallow it. And so I do think that there's an important discussion to have within the IC, which I'm sure you're having, and in the public a little less so, about the opportunity cost of investing in sort of buying OSINT, as it were, as opposed to focusing on the exquisite intelligence capabilities that you must do and that cannot be replaced. So I don't think you actually have an alternative but to find a way to integrate the Osin ecosystem. I think the question that I would ask, and I have no idea what you're doing on this front, so it is actually just a question. Are you focused on trying to teach people how to do OSINT or how to use OSINT analysis and product? Because I actually think that there's a whole MOS in how to interoperate with the OSINT ecosystem. And there's a whole Tradecraft there about how to understand that ecosystem, how to map it, how to see what it is, how to decide what parts of it you can trust to be there for you, because you're right. You have an obligation to the U.S. government to make sure that stuff gets done. And if I decide to stop producing Ukraine maps and you are relying on my Ukraine maps, then that's not okay. But there are parts of this ecosystem and aspects of this ecosystem that are so robust at this point that you can be confident that if I stop doing it, somebody else is going to keep doing it. And so part of it is figuring out what parts of the ecosystem you can trust to be there and actually rely on. Because look, at the end of the day, my analogy is you don't own the internet either. But lots of what you couldn't function without the internet at the end of the day, at least as I understand it. The IC enterprise, could you operate if the internet just shut down? Maybe. But I think it would be a big challenge. And I think that there are things that you trust to be there, and there are things that you can do that. So I think the key here from the IC perspective is what is the skill set that you need to develop to know how to interact with not just our data, because the one thing I do want to say is OSINT does not equal big data. It's more than that. We don't actually live in a big data world. We live in a curated data world. How do you interact with data? How do you interact with the analysis? How do you assess it? How do you bring it in? How do you use it? There's a whole bunch of tradecraft that's there, and I think focusing on that as a priority might be more valuable than focusing on how to do OSINT within the IC walls, per se. And so I think that's what I would offer.
So I'm going to come back to you in just a second and let you stew on that one for a minute. But I want to shift. I got a question from the audience, and this is really for just Kristen, if Fred wants to comment on this one as well. Even though you're not in government, but the question is, how do we as government purchasers of commercial PI ensure vendors are legally and ethically collecting? So what you do through the gristmill exchange, can you talk about how you validate your vendors before you bring them in?
Yeah, so actually I'm really appreciative of the question, because I just took a note that we hadn't gotten to that discussion, and I know all three of us feel really strongly that data ethics and privacy are really important elements of everything we do, regardless of where we sit, and that protecting U.S. information is vital. So that is a huge element for us in terms of how we operate as an exclusively private sector company. And so just in terms of process, we've engaged former IC attorneys to make sure we understand what the lanes are as far as government responsibilities and ours. We've engaged attorneys who understand how things go wrong for companies when they face litigation for data things, which in a GDPR world, it can be something like up to 8% of your annual revenue in terms of fines. So we all have to take this very seriously, and I know those in industry do. But for us, it's making sure that when we're talking to data sources, we don't actually ever we don't have anyone come to us. We go find companies based on what we know mission requirements are, based on what we know from our days inside the kinds of information are needed. And what we found is really interesting is a lot of companies never really realized that some of their data would be useful to government missions. Some of the data that they have available, I think from the hardest of the hard issues, from counterintelligence perspective, it's stunning what insights it could bring. So doing this all in a way that protects not only USP information, but PII, and that's where we've gone to, is whether it's US or Five Eyes or anyone, we do not pass on PII information at all, period. So no one's going to interact with that when they come to our site. Now, some government entities have the responsibility to see that kind of information. They have the authorities. They can purchase it that way, but it's not available for all to see. So a huge piece, a really, really important piece of it, and it needs to underpin all of this, because the advantage our adversaries have over us, being authoritarian regimes is they don't care at all. So for us, it's going to be a road bump in our process, but the road bump that allows us to keep our democracy as we're pursuing all of this.
So Greg, you had a chance to digest Fred's comments. I want to come back to what is the vision, now General Barry is the functional manager for open source. Fred kind of talked, you can't afford all of this, and how are you going to build this and what some of those skill sets should look like as you build out what is an analyst, as a collection manager, and how does that ecosystem function?
Yeah, I think I'm really glad you asked that question, because I think it kind of brings it together, and we're probably, we probably see things more alike than not. We don't want to do it, we want to use it. But I think for me, when we talk about the people that are doing open source intelligence, it's what you described as the people who figure out how to use it, right? So that's kind of this break between people that I would put in a collection discipline, right? How do we figure out which open source information we can leverage and pull in? That's the people that we're trying to build. We're trying to build folks who understand that environment, and then I want our analysts to be able to incorporate that into everything else that they do. So I think it's more the use than do, which we would put into that kind of open source collection discipline, for lack of a better word. What I really find interesting is we use it now, right? I mean, we will work with various academic institutions that they'll reach out and say, hey, we got people working on thesis statements. What would be interesting to you, right? I mean, there's ways that we do that now and work with on the analytics side. We're way more comfortable, I think, historically on the collecting information side than we are working on in the analysis side of the house. Largely because our comfort level in being able to unpack that analysis and understand the tradecraft behind it. So the more that tradecraft is transparent, the easier it is for us to go, hey, I get how you got there, right? And so our effort really is, to your point, we can't do it. There's no reason to do it. Other people are doing it, right? And so what we want to be able to do is figure out how best to incorporate and use it. So it's that latter part. But I think for me, that's the discipline we're trying to put in place with the Open Source Intelligence Center to be able to do that better.
So I alluded to a paper or an article we had in Defense One last year. We talked about insufficiently budgeted and is not scaling. And I'm going to come back to Greg on this one, then I'll go to Fred and Christian for some closing comments on whether or not we need an agency. So start thinking about that one. I may give Greg a buy on that one. But one of the challenges, as you look at the budget and kind of what we put in the article in Defense One last year is there's a lot of discussion, but the budgetary decisions don't necessarily match the narrative of the emphasis to allow you to grow this ecosystem. So do you see growth, and where is risk in our ability to scale this for all the things that Fred and Kristen and you have talked about?
I think we have got to grow our capability just in general. In a macro sense, we have to grow it. But within that, we have to do it smartly. There's a lot of redundancy in that enterprise. There's a lot of lack of interoperability in that enterprise for us. And so before we just kind of randomly go out there and say we're going to throw a bunch of money at it, I think we got to get better at it. That's part of what that Open Source Intel Center is trying to do is optimize what we currently have and make it as efficient as we possibly can. That's the first step, I think, in anything. And then I think we've got to get to where we grow capacity and capability. If 80% of what we're using is coming out of this environment, I'll call it that instead of an int. If it's coming out of this environment, then we have got to adapt to that. And when you look, without getting any numbers, when you look at where we invest people and resources in the intelligence community, I don't know that that's aligned the same way. So we certainly have to look at doing that smarter and then more of it in a way that makes sense.
So let me go to Kristen. A lot's been written about whether we need to build an agency that just handles this particular part of collection and production. Get your thoughts on that, having what you see now in your current capacity, your experience with the Open Source Center, and then your background as an analyst. What's the right way ahead?
So I'm conflicted on this. I think the cost, just the strict cost of standing up an open source agency of the size that you would need, right? So think an NGA or an NSA funded component is, I don't know that there's an appetite for that on the Hill. And the truth is that open source is being done throughout every USG entity there is for their own purposes. And so I feel a little less that it's about creating an open source agency than maybe right-sizing what we do with open source. So the Open Source Center, FBIS in the day, Open Source Center, now Open Source Enterprise, had this global D&I-led mission to lead open source across the IC and with various defense intelligence entities as well, but was never staffed to do that. And if we think about the breadth of our mission, what HHS might need to protect the medical industrial base, what they might need to know versus what someone at US Indo-PACOM who's facing, something going on in the South China Sea, the breadth and scope of mission is so varied, and that those mission practitioners are the ones who are going to know best what data to be drawn. I really think if there's an open source focused effort, it should be defined and scoped, and maybe it's around the tradecraft, if you will. How do we create standardized tradecraft and a train-the-trainer model where people come to the school and learn how to do this and take it away to their various schools and entities to teach others. If it's an open source agency, I would worry people would think it would be all things to all people, and it can't succeed because the mission needs are too specific and tactical. But developing policies and procedures, particularly around civil liberties, around protecting USP data, around making the Hill comfortable, helping our citizenry be comfortable with the fact that this is being done at scale to protect the nation. I think that is a huge part of that, and having a single entity that has that focus could be quite useful. I think the truth is too that every officer needs to master this data literacy that you've talked about, and pushing it over to an open source agency, I feel like would end up with us not, the tide not rising for all ships. It's a huge piece of what we need to do, but I do feel like we're so far behind because our adversaries are using this against us with misinformation and disinformation campaigns. They're doing it for the elections again. We don't really have a response in that space that can happen at the speed of mission. And so I think the speed of insight game is one that we need to do better at, and having an open source entity that can help us do that is a piece of it. The other thing I would say is there's a lot of conversation about security clearance reform, and I promise not to digress into that too much, but people here don't need to be cleared. I mean, you could partner with academia and private sector and people who have conditional offers of employment as opposed to making them wait 6, 9, 12 months. Have them go to work. If they have a PhD in, I don't know, Chinese economy or supply chain economics or whatever, put them to work. And so they're becoming data literate while they're processing, and frankly, government has an opportunity to see them at work, to see if maybe they're clearable, but really they're terrible to work with. So we have, other reasons to decide. But this is an incredible opportunity to get folks to work together. The consortium model is one that we're seeing our Five Eyes partners move to. It's really interesting to me, they're talking about, in the UK anyway, outsourcing their intel questions to a consortium that includes academia and the private sector. And the company that comes back, or the entity that comes back with the best answers, they're going to say, okay, I'm going to pick you, you, and you, and bring it on up. So there may be something to that model that we can adapt as well. But I do worry, budget-wise, and then political will-wise, that an open source agency would be a huge problem. But we also have some unprotected space. So we think about our national security community as being the government space, and we've talked about major corporations that do contracting work. They're also absolutely under attack from nation-state level actors, but so are small companies, and so are academic institutions around the world. And so if we could focus that open source effort on, I don't know, the defense industrial base, or the medical industrial base, or critical infrastructure, or a piece where the entities and existing IC and DoD agencies felt like, let's collectively work on that. Maybe that's a place where we could build collective trust and the tradecraft and standards to apply more broadly across the system.
That's a very thoughtful answer. Fred, your thoughts on an agency?
I'll give you, I promise I'll give you thoughts on that. I want to pick up on one thing that Kristen said that I think is very important, and I'm going to make an unfair sort of snit here, and I recognize what's unfair about it, but I once had the opportunity to go out to the Open Source Center out in, where it is. And it's, it's in the place with the highest single concentration of undisclosed locations in the world. And it's an undisclosed location with a huge huge gate and lots of guards, not in uniform. And you need a secret clearance, and it's all secret, no foreign to get in there. And I thought to myself, there's something wrong with this picture, because we're going in here to have a bunch of analysts who are, read the New York Times and looking at a bunch of other stuff you can get on the internet. I totally understand why it is like that. I want to be clear. I totally understand why it is like that, but it is a fundamental problem that the government has. Do we take RFIs from the government? No. Why not? Because the government can't make RFIs of us, because government RFIs are classified. I don't have a clearance, which is fine. Do we find a way to work it around? Yes, of course we do. And there are ways to work it around. I'm going through this to say we need to recognize that 80-20, great for information, that's awesome. The budget can't be 80-20. Okay, you cannot have an intelligence community budget 80% of which is going to open source and 20% of which is going to exquisite intelligence, because then the IC will fail in its fundamental mandate of providing the essential exquisite intelligence the nation needs. So we can't look for budgetary alignment on that any more than we can imagine that the IC needs to start operating in an unclassed space so that it can play properly in the OSINT world. There's going to have to be a compromise in both of these arenas, and I think we can do better. I don't know if it's a consortium or something else. I'm pretty sure it's not an agency. And I think there are lots of reasons for that, but I think Kristen really put her finger on the key one. The ability to use OSIN has to pervade the intelligence enterprise. In fact, it has to pervade the USG. It is a tradecraft issue, it is an MOS issue, it is a specialty issue, it is an educational issue, it is an organizational issue for every single organization. And my fear would be that if you create an agency for it, then everybody will say, great, they'll take care of the OSINT problem for us. And we could just be consumers of whatever they put out. And that's fail, I think, in this enterprise. So I think it's a lot harder to fix than that. I think the agency is looking for some kind of very expensive easy button. And I think this is hard. I think what Greg is talking about doing is hard. But I think it's the right thing that's got to happen. It needs to happen at every organization that has to operate in this world, which is pretty much every organization in the United States government. So I think the problem is harder to solve, much more complicated, will take much longer, might be less expensive to solve, therefore, weirdly, but harder. And I think we do need to be careful to avoid the trap of imagining that if we throw enough money at it, we can make it easier, do it fast. And I think we might be able to just fail fast and expensively that way. That would be my concern.
So we are at time. So please join me in a round of applause for our panel. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm sorry we didn't get to too many of your questions, but very much appreciate it. And again, for the panel, thanks so much for your thoughts.